Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Clarissa Sais. I'm from the International Office at the Federal University of Paraná, and I'll be introducing the chair of the session, Professor André Luiz Rodaki, who will be leading this session about the SDG 3, good health and well-being. He has a bachelor's degree in physical education and sports training, a master's in biodynamics from the University of São Paulo, and he holds a PhD in exercise and sports sciences from the Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. He is a full professor at the Federal University of Paraná, and he was the coordinator of the areas of physical education, physiotherapy, phonoaudiology, and occupational therapy in CAPES from 2011 until 2017. In addition, he was the general coordinator of the graduate programs of the Federal University of Paraná from 1997 until 2010. He has published more than 150 peer-reviewed papers. Most of them were published in international journals with impact factor. He has an expertise in exercise and sports sciences with emphasis on biomechanics, and he has a particular research interest in performance, aging, spinal column, and the movement coordination. His research project seeks to understand the strategies applied in falls experienced by elderly people and amputees, in addition to training effects on functionality. Please, Professor, you can take from here.
Okay, thank you very much, Clarissa, for your words and this presentation. And following with presentations, I'll like to present Professor Claudio Cunha, who's a colleague from the pharmacology department here at the university, who has a line of research that is very much parallel with what Professor Rainer Schwarting is doing. So Professor Cunha, he has a bachelor degree in biological science obtained in '84 and a master's in biological science with emphasis on molecular biology, both obtained at University of Brasilia. Later, in '92, he earned a PhD in science with emphasis on biochemistry from Paraná Federal University. Nowadays, he's full professor at Paraná Federal University. His research is focused on understanding how the neural system, specifically how the actions are selected based on gratifying consequences. For such purposes, he applies from pharmacological, neurochemistry, electrochemistry, and electrophysiology techniques. The main specific contributions were validation of mice treatment with MPTP as cognitive deficit model in initial phase of Parkinson's disease, and also the broken mirror mosaic model that proposes that neurons code motor actions of body parts directed to objects as an attempt to elucidate actions selections in normal and pathologic conditions, including Parkinson's, Huntington, attentional deficits, hyperactivity, drug addiction, schizophrenia, and obsessive compulsive disorders. So please, Professor Claudio, I would like to ask you to present Professor Rainer Schwarting and also to co-host the session with us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for this presentation. Indeed, the one who is doing the job today is Professor Rainer Schwarting. So as he told, we have a long-term partnership. Most of it that has been funded by CAPES. CAPES program, that is a international program that is bilateral, Germany and Brazil. And he's one of the most recognized and well-known person in animal behavior, animal models of some disease, which includes Parkinson's disease, schizophrenia, other mania, depression, and several other kinds of disease. and more particularly in the most recent years, he's been studying communication of rodents that can tell something about social interactions and has been used as models of several of these diseases. He's a psychologist. He has a PhD in psychobiology, is it right? At the University of Düsseldorf in Germany. He's a full professor at the Philipps-Universität of Marburg, also in Germany, and has been until recently Dean of Science in that university. And have several, I would not name, but I would say that it's more than 200 published papers in in our field, some of them with high impact and very cited. And this is how I found him firstly. So the speech he's going to do today, I wouldn't be able to do that. It is very broad at the same time and scientific to find someone to tell us about emotional states, particularly emotional states that in humans is related to happiness. It's something quite complicated, but if there is someone I know that can do that, it's Professor Heiner Schwartz, that I will let you with him right now. And thank Professor Wojtek for the opportunity, and especially Professor Heiner Schwartz for taking his time to do and to prepare us this talk. So thank you, and thank you for the audience.
Just change seats. No, fine. So thank you for the invitation and for the introduction. I must say, when Claudio first asked me whether I would be able to contribute to this symposium, I was very hesitant because the topic of this symposium goes far beyond what I can say. But then I thought, well, let's give it a try. And you will see now in the next minutes what came out of this try. Trying to run the presentation. Okay, so first of all, I would like to frame the topic worldwide, let's say. And the question, you don't have to answer it, but the question is, how many people in the world probably suffer from mental or substance use disorders? And the answer is almost 1 billion. And if you look at specific data, for example, we have the very helpful databases from Our World in Data, where you can look at various diseases. And there I focused on mental and substance use disorders, because if you look at this worldwide, you can see that they substantially contribute to the total global disease burden. And what you see in this slide is a list of various diseases and disorders, and their burden is expressed as a so-called disability adjusted life years. This is a common measure which tries to somehow quantify the number of years lost due to ill health, disability, or early death. And when you look at the percentages, you can see that, of course, and as expected, cardiovascular diseases and cancers, for example, they rank highly. So they contribute most to the overall disability adjusted life years. But if you go down the list to the 5th position, which is marked by the asterisk, you can see that mental and substance use disorders are prominent in this list. So they rank about 5th and make up about 5% of this total burden. Another picture from the same source, which shows the distribution over the entire world. And the bluer the graph is, the higher is the share of disability. And you can see that several countries have considerable burdens. And for example, Brazil, you can see here, which is about in the 5 to 10% range. And if you look at Europe, then it's pretty similar. So it's a worldwide phenomenon. So what actually contributes, which kinds of disorders are we talking about? What are these mental and substance use disorders? And the major percentage of that are anxiety disorders. They are very prevalent worldwide, followed by depression, which is also very, very prominent. The next one is alcohol use disorders, followed by other drugs of abuse, so like heroin or amphetamine, cocaine, and others. Then bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and eating disorders. And the graphic shows that anxiety and depression rank most highly. I also tried to make a comparison, or I took actually graphs from the source from the World Health Organization to compare your country with my country to see what are the top 10 causes of these lost years and what are the reasons. And of course, there are some differences between Brazil and Germany. For example, if you look at the first rank, then interpersonal violence ranks most highly in Brazil, whereas in Germany, it's ischemic heart disease. But this is not what I'm focusing on. But if you look further down, and I highlighted this a bit, anxiety disorders and depressive disorders have about a similar rank in both countries. So they are about the 8th or 9th position on those top 10 causes. So they contribute substantially to the loss of life years, or quality of life in both countries. Now, what has this to do with pleasures and pains? First of all, it's clear that mental and substance use disorders are often associated with or even characterized by changes in pleasures and pains. That is, you find changes in emotional and motivational functions. For example, depression is often characterized by the loss of pleasure and motivation, or social withdrawal is very typical for anxiety and specific disorders of anxiety. So this is a loss. And on the other hand, you find disorders where there is enhanced pleasures or pleasure seeking. For example, mania as a feature of bipolar disorder or addiction. But also physical pain is very common in mental substance use disorders. For example, and you could mention many more examples, but for example, abdominal or chest pain is very common in depression or anxiety, or physical withdrawal symptoms, which can be very severe, are typical for certain kinds of addiction, for example, withdrawal from heroin or withdrawal from alcohol. But besides physical pain, there is also often psychological pain. For example, guilt in depression, or nightmares in case of anxiety, or emotional suffering. This brings us to the question, what are the possible reasons for such so prevalent mental disorders? And the current thinking in the scientific literature is that we have to see all of them, I would say, in a biopsychosocial framework, which means that we nowadays know that a number of factors can contribute to the occurrence and the features of a given mental disorders. And some of them are at the biological level, some at the psychological, and some of the social level. And of course, they can interact in various ways. And in these three blue boxes, I have just listed several of the major and well-known factors. So certain genes or epigenetic regulations can be critical. Perinatal complications can be critical. Infections, famines, which can lead to unfavorable brain development, and this can affect various levels of analysis like neurotransmitters, hormones, and also physical illness can be a reason, for example, to develop a certain mental disorder. Psychologically, of course, one has factors like stress or traumatic experiences, certain personality factors, which may be again linked also to genetic factors, can increase or decrease, dependent on the constellation of these factors, the likelihood of mental disorders. Maltreatment during childhood is a well-known factor in various mental disorders, and substance abuse, especially at certain developmental ages, can be very critical for mental disorders to occur. And then finally, social factors like instability within the family, the loss of a partner or an important relative. Urbanization is known to contribute, for example, to the occurrence of schizophrenia, and in a similar way, migration can do this, and of course, factors like unemployment. And the importance of this picture is that for many kinds of mental disorders, these factors can play a role, and it's with few exceptions, it's not a single factor, but usually the interaction of several factors which may take place or start to act at different levels of development, starting before birth and going up until adulthood. And of course, there's a lot of literature which deals with the question of what has this to do with the brains. And one can show a number of summarizing figures for the systems which are known to play a role for certain mental disorders. And I don't want to try to summarize all these findings, but just take one example here, the example of depression, as it was summarized in a study published in Lancet in 2012, which shows for one, brain areas which have repeatedly been shown to be related to the occurrence of depression. For example, that the size of a brain area may change, or the activity or reactivity in the system may change. And these brain areas can or are found at different levels of the brain. So what you almost never see, I would say, is that there's one critical core system which can be considered, this is the correlate of disease X. Rather, it's a multitude of brain areas, a multitude of transmitters which serve to communicate within these brain areas. And in most years, it has become more and more important not to look only at a brain area as such, but also at the interaction between brain areas and their connectivity and how good, for example, they interact. And for example, what the picture here in a way tries to show is that critical brain areas, and not all of them are shown actually here, are found not only in our most developed part of the brain, namely the prefrontal cortex, but also deep in the brain. For example, the amygdala, which is also shown in this diagram, or the ventral striatum, and also certain transmitters which have their offspring deep in the brain and project into various areas in the forebrain. This summary picture and similar kinds for other disorders like schizophrenia or anxiety are based on evidence which was obtained in humans, so in actually clinical research, but also in animal models. And animal models usually means rodents, that is rats or mice. And ideally, the two approaches, so studying humans or studying animal models, should interact, should contribute to each other. So ideally, this should be an integrative approach. Why does it have advantages to work with animal models? And where are certain limits, let's say? When it comes to animal models, a clear advantage is that it's almost endless means of what you can manipulate. For example, in the brain, in the genes, or also in the environment of the animals. And this can occur at various stages of animal development. So, for example, one can try to find critical phases and then provide a stimulatory environment or a very impoverished environment. And I will show an example later on. Also, an advantage of the animal model is that you can analyze the brain or aspects of the brain with extremely high resolution, not only in terms of anatomical resolution, but also temporal resolution, even deep in the brain, which is, for example, difficult and limited in humans. Even in rats or mice, one can also study individual factors, and these factors which make the animal more susceptible on the one hand, but also more resilient to a burden. And this is something which is, of course, also clinically relevant, because we know that a certain impact, for example, the loss of a partner, does not have the same effect in every person, but some are more susceptible, whereas others are resilient. We want to like to know what makes us either this way or the other way. Of course, like in humans, we can study drug treatments and maybe even develop drug treatments. So these are major examples for the pros. On the other hand, of course, animal models have limitations. And what one should not forget is that a rat or mouse is not a little human. It's a non-human animal species. And since we are talking about mental disorders, we have to consider that a rat or mouse has a brain with much less complexity than a human brain. And it is possible that complexity can also lead to more problems than simple brains. And also it has to be considered that although several symptoms of a given mental disorder can be modeled in a mouse, for example, some clinical symptoms are surely not convertible. And for example, the feeling of guilt or rumination in depression is, I would say, impossible to model in a rat. And there are other examples, especially when it comes to the subjective side of a given disorder. And there's also another problem, which is often neglected, namely the question, what should actually be modeled in a rat or a mouse? Of course, one would say, yeah, I want a model of schizophrenia, or I want a model of depression. And often researchers claim that the model they have are a model of a given disorder. But one should be careful, because when looking or when coming from the clinical side, one immediately sees that the clinical side is complex. And I tried to explain this or make this clear with this graph here, which was taken from schizophrenia. And what the graph is saying is that according to ICD-10 or DSM-5, so the clinical classification systems, a disorder like schizophrenia is complex, has different diagnostic criteria like hallucinations, delusions, but also restricted affect or social withdrawal or loss of volition, loss of motivation. But the important point is that a given patient may have a mix of these symptoms, and a patient A, which I try to graphically very simply highlight here, may cluster with certain criteria, whereas patient B might look pretty different, or patient C might look again very different. And I think everybody working clinically can agree to this logic, namely that schizophrenia is not like schizophrenia. There are many forms of schizophrenia. And then if one turns to the animal model, actually the question is, what are you actually modeling? Are you focusing on a certain subtype? Are you focusing on certain symptoms which you try to model? In the last years, the NIMH in the US has come with a different approach, sorry for the animation, to deal with this complexity. And what they did, I don't know why it moves. What they did is they developed the logic of research domain criteria. And I try to highlight this here. You see 4 types of mental disorders: depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and autism spectrum disorders, which are at first sight very different, of course. And here some features of depression, like the depressed mood or increased energy activity in bipolar disorders, are just shown as examples. So on the one hand, they are pretty different, but this research domain criteria tries to take another approach, namely saying, part of the animation is missing, sorry, that we have to look at such disorders more with an abstract eye. For example, we should look at cognitive deficits as one domain, or social deficits as another, and there are more than shown here. And when you do this, what you can see is that disorders which appear very distinct at first sight share changes in those some of those research domain criteria. And here I highlighted social interaction and cognitive deficits because this will be the examples for which I will show you some slides in a minute. Because this now brings me to what we in Marburg are actually doing in the context of affective disorders. So we have a consortium funded by the DFG, which is the German Academic Research Council. It's a consortium of with members of 3 universities in Germany. And the common topic of it is to study the neurobiology of affective disorders in a translational way, which addresses several levels, especially the level of the brain and its function. And this consortium mainly works with humans, so with patients and also healthy people, but it also has an animal side, which is run mainly by my lab. So we work with a certain animal model. And this is somehow what we are doing is shown in this summary slide. That is, if you work disease-oriented, you have to make a decision on how you handle your model. So our logic was, we want to take a gene as the start. That is, we work with a certain genetically modified rat. I will explain this in a minute. And this modification we use to characterize the animals throughout their lifetime. And this is why we have this long temporal axis here. And we specifically look at a certain, we specifically look at certain phases, like early childhood of a rat or adolescence, because these are phases where there's dynamics in behavior with consequences, long-term consequences, but also dynamics in at the level of physiology and the brain. So what we do is we phenotype these animals on various behavioral levels. So we use a number of tests to characterize the animals. And also we ourselves look at certain, at certain brain mechanisms. And we cooperate with our partners because they study, for example, immune factors in these animals or cellular stress and so on. Importantly, what we also do is we not only have the genetic modification as one risk factor, but also environmental factors as a second, like multiple hits, which may interact to result in a certain outcome. And here it is very typical to work, for example, with social isolation as a bad environment or enrichment as a more healthy, health-related environment. As I said, we start with a gene. So we decided to go for a certain gene. And the gene we are working with in this consortium is the CACNA1C gene. Why? This gene has repeatedly been shown, especially in genome-wide association studies in humans, to be a risk factor, modifications in the gene to be associated with the occurrence of various mental disorders. So it's not specific to one disorder, but the relationships are also seen in depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and autism spectrum disorders. And here is only one example from the literature showing the occurrence of polymorphisms of various genomic positions. And here highlighted the CACNA1C gene because it tends to pop out to be more related to these disorder occurrence than several other genes. It's not the only one which you could study, but it's one which is, I would say, a good candidate. What is this gene? What does it serve for? The CACNA1C gene is located on the human chromosome 12, and it codes for a subunit of a calcium channel, a specific calcium channel. Here you have a picture of a synapse in the brain. So here you see the presynaptic ending of one neuron, and you see the synaptic cleft, and then you see the membrane of the next neuron. And what the figure shows is that the normal regulation is that the transmitter, which is in certain vesicles, can be released into the cleft and then can act on postsynaptic receptors to lead to an action on these receptors, so the normal functioning. For this functioning, the calcium channel plays an important role because the information provided by the presynaptic cell can only lead to release of transmitter if the calcium channel is activated. And this is precisely the place where the CACNA1C gene and its protein contribute. That is, the protein, excuse me, determines the efficiency of the protein, determines the excitability, but also the plasticity of such neurons. I should mention that this protein is not only found in neurons, but it also plays a prominent role in smooth muscles. So cardiovascular regulation is dependent on such a protein. You also find it in pancreas cells and fibroblasts. We have a rat model. Many people work with mice models, but we prefer to work with rat models. And there's a specific technique, which I'm not going to explain, but the only message here at the moment is that the genetic modification in this given rat model is that the genetic information for this gene is disturbed by the genetic deletion of 4 base pairs, which are shown here. And this leads to a reduced usability of protein outcome. How do we measure this? Or what actually do we apply? We work with rats, which, as one says in genetics, are heterozygous. That is, for this gene, which I just explained, they have one allele which is intact, and the other allele is defect. We compare these animals to wild-type animals, which have both intact alleles. Why don't we work with complete knockouts? The answer is very simple, because the complete knockout cannot survive because the control of the cardiovascular function cannot work, since the relevant protein is totally missing. So these animals do not survive. We work with a heterozygous offspring. If you do this, you have to control, of course, that you actually have this heterozygous genetic phenotype, but you also have to show that it has an effect on the protein, on the outcome. And to show this, we analyze tissue samples of rat cortex and rat hippocampus to areas where this protein is prevalent, and we found in both brain areas an about 50% reduction in the protein level. So rather considerable reduction of the protein, I would say. As I said, we are phenotyping these rats on various levels and compare them to genetically intact rats. And as I said also before, there are several brain areas which are critical candidates in such diseases, for example, depression, but also other diseases like the prefrontal cortex or the hippocampus. So we asked whether the genetic deficiency leads to changes in the gross morphology, for example, the prefrontal cortex or the hippocampus. And these are examples for the study where we took brain sections, defined different brain areas. So here you see part of the hippocampus in the upper figure, and in the lower figure, you see prefrontal areas. So they were selectively analyzed, and we can make it the story short. In none of them, we saw considerable change in their size. And also we did not see a change in the general size of the brain. So at this level of analysis, the genetic defect has no apparent consequence. It also had no major consequence on hippocampal neurogenesis, which is a very hot candidate for many years. And for example, which plays a role, was thought to play a role, for example, loss of neurogenesis in depression. But we analyzed various features of newborn neurons in the brain. Here's just one example, and you see in yellow such a cell which is marked as a newborn cell. And we also took several other measures to quantify them and identify they are neurons and so on. But in none of these measures we found an effect of the CAGNAC1C deficiency, which is a bit, one could say, disappointing. Now let's turn to behavior and our phenotypic characterization of that behavior. As I said, we are interested in critical phases and possible critical time windows of the animal development. And you see here, let's say the part of the life of rat up to 3 months of age. They get older than that, of course, but this is until they reach young adulthood. And here highlighted, you see the juvenile age, which is a very dynamic age with certain behavior features, for example. During this phase of their development, the animals are dependent on social interactions with their peers. And this is a period where you can, of course, change this environment. And this is highlighted down here. So in the middle, you see a picture which just tries to show the standard housing in a group. Yeah, there's not much going on apart from that they can live in groups and can interact. The left picture stands for animals living alone in a cage. So they are isolated from physical interaction, but of course they are not isolated from acoustic interaction or smell and so on. But it's kind of a social isolation. And the right picture stands for the contrary. Here we again house animals in groups, but they have a lot of objects and the environment is very complex. There's a lot of activity which the animals can show. So that's an example of an enriched environment. To test the consequences of these environmental manipulations and their possible interactions with genetic background, we use various tests. And I want to show you just one example, which is the so-called object recognition test. This is kind of a short-term memory test. And the test goes as following. First, the animal is exposed to a simple open field arena, which contains two identical objects. And the animal has no task, and what it usually does is it explores these objects. Then we wait maybe 30 minutes or 1 hour, and we repeat the test, but one of the objects is modified. So there's now a familiar object in red and a novel object as indicated by the gray area. And for every normal rat, the typical behavioral response is to explore that object which is not familiar. Yeah? And this is why the test is often called the novel object test. So we first had our animals in their social or non-social environments during their juvenile age, and then we tested them in the novel object test. And what you can see here, the slide is a bit busy, but I try to highlight the critical aspects. You have to read the picture always in the way that the first bar has to be compared to the second bar, because for a given rat model, this shows how much they explore the old object versus the new object. And what you should expect is that there should be more exploration of the novel object. This is the basic outcome, which you can see here in many cases indicated by the asterisks. But in those animals which had been isolated, which had been kept under isolation, this effect is no longer significant. They show a trend for it, but as compared to the other groups, which are always have a significant effect, social isolation apparently impaired performance in the novel object test. And this effect was not due to an unspecific effect. You could argue, yeah, maybe they're exploring less, they have less interest in these objects. This is not the case. It was actually the discrimination which showed the defect. On the other hand, we have no selective deficit in the CACNA1C rats, which is highlighted here by the second red area. They behave like they're wild type controlled animals, they're intact controlled animals. So this would be another example where you would say, your model is not very good because it doesn't show very much. But of course, this is not the end of the story, because we analyzed our rats also in social behavior. The second domain I had highlighted in the beginning of the talk. And here, we did not deprive the animals during their juvenile age, but we looked at their behavior during the juvenile age. And the behavior at that time in the literature is called rough and tumble play. I hope that the video works and that you can see this. Hopefully you cannot only see the video, but you also can hear something, because what this shows, this video shows, are two juvenile rats, and it looks as if they are fighting, as if they are aggressive to each other, but they are not. At this age, this is play, and it is reciprocal play. There's no one winning. Sometimes one is above and next moment the other. This play behavior has certain features. It's not random. And here on the right, you see that you can characterize certain parts, certain phases of this play, which we also quantify, of course. Animals, rats have to show this play behavior during the juvenile age because it's critical for the further development of their social behavior and also for development of certain aspects of the brain. In this behavior for the rats is very pleasurable. And one indirect indication is that, for example, they would work, if you let them work for this to have the possibility to show this behavior, they would work for it. And what they also do, they emit a lot of ultrasonic vocalizations, that is vocalizations we as humans cannot hear, but which we can make audible with certain technical equipment. And what you hopefully heard during the video was ultrasonic. We just made it audible so that we can listen to it. These calls serve for social communication, and they may reflect in a way the emotional state, the motivation to interact in terms of a positive interaction. And both play and vocalizations are dependent on certain brain areas and neurotransmitters in the brain, especially dopamine, but also endogenous opiates. We use this behavior to test our Cagna-Guanci rats in terms of how do they play and how do they vocalize. And our paradigm is described here. So first of all, one rat waits in a cage for 3 minutes. Then a second rat is put into the same cage and the two can play. And they do this. Maybe not so much on the first day, but if you repeat this on the second day or the third day, this becomes more and more intense in terms of play and also in terms of vocalization. And what also occurs that the rat, which is waiting for the play to come, is already vocalizing, dependent on the previous experience, which somehow is in kind of anticipation of the coming positive social interaction. And here's some data which we obtained with such a design. On the top left, you see quantification of their play, so what is visible. And the black curve is the play behavior of the intact rats, and the white curve is that of the Cagna-Guanci rats. Again, the picture shows that there's no substantial difference between controls and Cagna-Guanci rats. But if we look at the vocalization recorded at the same time, then we see that the Cagna-Guanci rats vocalize clearly less than their controls. And you see the same when you look at the phase prior to the play. So when they wait for the play, there you can see that controls nicely enhance their vocalization rates over days of anticipation, whereas the Cagna-Guanci rats only moderately show such an effect and do not further increase, for example, on the third day. So this is one example. I could also show, of course, other examples where we clearly have a change in our genetic model, but a change in a measure of social behavior and a measure which is related to emotion and motivation in these animals. The behavior I showed was the behavior of the sender. So how much do they vocalize? These vocalizations are not just fun. They have a biological value. They lead to effects in the sender, in the recipients. And to measure these effects, we use a playback paradigm. And this is shown here. There's a lot of noise, but this is technical noise and it's not as loud as it might appear. So what you just saw was a normal rat. On the radial maze, we look from the top, and there was no task for the rat. It can locomote or sit or do whatever it wants. But after a couple of minutes, we play back vocalizations, which we, of course, cannot hear, but we make them audible for control purposes. And this is what you just heard. And I think it was very clear when the playback onset occurred. It was a sequence of calls from another rat recorded before. And the source of these calls were a loudspeaker down here in the picture. And it was very clear that the animal was activated by these signals and was approaching the source as if it attempted to interact with the possible conspecific animal signaled by these vocalizations. This behavior we use to also phenotype our animals. So in terms of how strong is their response to these calls. And on the right, you see an example of our studies with the Cagnac-1C rats. And the graph is has to be read as follows. We have we have the response towards the playback source going up in the graph, and the avoidance of the other side. So whenever you go to one side, you cannot go to the other side. So you see, for example, the black bar shows control animals show strong approach response and show only few activity distal from the sound source. And what you also can see in the white bars is that our Cagnac-1C rats show only a very moderate response. So there is some tendency to approach the sound source, but it's clearly much less expressed than in the controls. So we not only have a deficit in these socially relevant calls in terms of emitting them, but also responding to them.
Professor Schwarting,
yeah.
Just a second. I would just like you to remind you that we have more 5 minutes.
Yes.
We have a presentation on the sequence. Thank you very much.
I'm almost done. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So the question, of course, arises, with which brain systems could this, to which brain systems could this effect belong? And there's a lot of literature showing that play behavior, vocalizations, and approach behavior are related to a dopamine function in the brain, especially one system, which is shown in the graph down here, the so-called mesolimbic dopamine system, which originates deep in the brain and projects into the forebrain, especially in the nucleus accumbens, not only in rats or mice, but also in humans. We didn't study the dopamine system itself, but we used a drug which is known to stimulate this system. And this is a psychostimulant, a drug called d-amphetamine, a widely used drug in animal research. We administered the drug to our animals, so to controls and Cagnac-1C animals. And the important graph is the lower one. That is what happens when we give amphetamine. And we have the white curve, which are the modified rats, and the black curves are the controls. There's some trend for difference, but it does not reach statistical significance in terms of how much they locomote. Yeah? But when we look at how much they vocalize, which is a typical outcome of d-amphetamine, there's a clear effect of the gene, of the genetic background, namely that controls show a nice effect, but the CACNA1C rats show considerably less vocalization, which leads us, together with the play behavior or the play vocalization, to the assumption that there might be some changes in this mesolimbic dopamine system, which of course requires specific research in the future. And this brings me to the end. So my first summary is regarding the second part of the talk is that the gene I showed you is from human studies known to be associated with various mental disorders. When we study this gene or a deficit in this gene in the rat model, we have the expected loss in the protein in various brain areas, but this does not affect the gross structure, at least in the forebrain or in the frontal cortex or the hippocampus, and it also does not change hippocampal neurogenesis. A negative social environment, here social juvenile isolation, yes, it shows, it leads to impaired cognitive function, as shown by the novel object test, but CACNA1C deficient subjects are not suffering in addition, yeah? So there's no interaction. But these rats show deficits on another domain, namely social behavior, which we saw in terms of the emission of ultrasonic calls, and also their approach to such calls. And the last point is in question marks. We can speculate whether this reflects a deficit in motion, in emotional or motivational mechanisms, and or a deficit in social communication. And finally, I showed you that we also have pharmacological evidence with the amphetamine, which is at least an indirect hint that actually there may be changes deeper in the brain, namely in the mesolimbic dopamine system. And this is my last slide. Mental disorders are global burdens, and they are often associated or even characterized by loss of pleasures and enhanced pain. A multitude of factors contribute to that at the biological, psychological, social level. Complex brain networks are involved. Animal models, I think, can help to better understand what is going on. And I try to show an example, namely from our studies with the CACNA1C rat. And here's my final slide, which shows the team in Marburg, and which also shows the financial support we received from several institutions. And I would specifically want to highlight that CAPES and the German equivalent, in a way, the German Academic Exchange Service, have been especially important for the interactions with my friends here in Brazil, especially in Curitiba. And with this, I would like to thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Rainer Schwarting. It was absolutely fantastic talk. I was delighted with this, especially because we are going to be conducting some research soon with some autism spectrum. So we probably have loads to discuss. I got a couple questions here, but as we are short in terms of time, we have a next guest already in our room. I'll send you the questions. I think Claudio can have access to the questions as well that are posed here in the chat. And I would like to invite you to answer these questions later on, maybe via email, because we are really short in terms of our time.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So Professor Rainer, I would like also to thank you very much, Professor Claudio da Cunha as well, and invite you and Claudio to stay here to watch our next guest, who's going to be presenting a fantastic team. Okay. I would like to invite Professor Wojtek Chodzko-Zajko. I think I pronounced it right, to turn his camera on. I don't know if Anna wants to make first a full picture of it. Anna, are you right?
Yes, I will. Yeah,
Yeah.
I took many pictures of Professor Einer already. So as soon as we can have Professor Wojtek, I will take some pictures.
Excellent. Okay, so I'll now introduce Professor Wojtek. Please, Professor Wojtek, correct me about your name, because there's
Very good.
lot,
I will.
a lot
My name is Wojtek Chodzko-Zajko. It is a Polish name.
Okay.
I am an Englishman married to a Brazilian.
Okay, excellent. So we have two things in common, right? I'm also Polish, and I'm also married to a Brazilian woman. Okay, Professor Wojtek, thank you very much for being with us. Okay, I'll just briefly introduce you here. Professor Wojtek earned his bachelor degree in education from University of London, and a PhD degree in kinesiology from Purdue University. Professor Chodzko-Zajko primary research interests area are of aging and health. For many years, he was the head of the Department of Kinesiology and Community Health, and the Sahid and Ann Carson Khan Endowed Professor of Applied Health Science at the University of Illinois. For the past 6 years, he has served as Dean of the Graduate College at the University of Illinois. He also focused his research on public policies and public health recommendations related to physical activity and healthy living. He served on the World Health Organization Committee that developed the WHO guidelines for physical activity among older persons. He was the principal investigator for a series of projects charged with developing a national strategy for promoting healthy aging in the USA. The National Blueprint, Increasing Physical Activity Among Adults Age 50 and Older, serves as a guide for multiple organizations, associations, and agencies to inform and support their planning work related to increase physical activity among America's aging population. He chaired the writing group that authored the American College of Sports Medicine position stand on physical activity exercise for older adults. He is also the founding editor of the Journal of Aging and Physical Activity from 1992 to 2002. He serves as chairman of the board of directors of the American Council on Exercise and is past president of the American Kinesiology Association. He currently serves as a president of the AAU Association of Graduate Schools and chair of the ETS Graduate Education Advisory Council. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for being with us. And you're good to go. And I think you have something about 40 to 45 minutes if you wish. And then we spare some time for questions. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rodatsky. I appreciate the invitation. I wish I could be in Curitiba with you, but I'm happy to join from my hotel room in New Orleans, Louisiana, where I am at a conference. And because the internet is not super reliable, that's why I'm going to ask somebody there to advance my slides rather than try and share my screen. So what do I want to do today? I want to tell you a story about 50 to 60 years of research and public policy related to promoting physical activity as a mechanism for improving healthy lifestyles and healthy outcomes. I'm going to focus primarily on work in the United States, although I will also talk about international initiatives. Next slide, please. I don't know who's advancing the slide. Hello?
Hang on just a second. I'll share my, I don't know who's sharing the screen. at the moment. I can share my screen.
Sorry, it's Aptor software. Just a second, I will ask them. And
Anna, if you would prefer, I think I can try and share my slides. Would that be easier?
Whatever suits you, whatever you're more comfortable.
Maybe, let's see if that will work. Just a minute. All right, hang on. Okay, I'm viewing the Aptor screen now.
yes, and I don't know what's happening with them because they have all the, I'm asking them here. Sorry for that.
That's okay. Anna, oh, okay. I think it's working now. So I'm going to argue that over the past 50 or 60 years, there have been really five critical phases of research into establishing the relationship between physical activity and healthy aging, or if you prefer, physical activity and the development of chronic diseases and conditions. Next slide.
Sorry, Professor. I think something. Okay.
Anna, why don't you stop sharing, and I will share my screen. Maybe it will be more efficient.
It's really not my. It's Aptor's. It's not my screen.
Ah, okay.
I don't know.
All right. So phase one is building the evidence base. Next slide. I think we need to ask Aptor to release the share screen so I can control it, because this is not going to work very well. Is it possible?
I think so. Anna, can you contact Aptor?
I'm contacting them. I don't know what's happening here. Aptor, please stop presenting. Aptor, please.
Okay, good. Let me try and do this now. Okay. All right, just a minute. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Very good. Okay. So I'm going to argue that there have been these 5 phases. The 2 initial phases in red, I believe, are already well established. And the 3 phases, phase 3, 4, and 5, I believe are still currently underway. So let's talk about phase 1, building the evidence base. I think 1940s, people believed that physiological decline and psychological changes were an inevitable consequence of chronological aging, and that they occurred in everybody at approximately similar rates. But a series of researchers in Scandinavia, in the United States of America, began to explore the impact of exercise and physical activity on the rate at which people age.
Sorry to interrupt you, Professor. Sorry, your screen looks gray to us.
Just a minute. Hang on. Let me try again. Is that any better? Can you see my slides now?
I can see the slide, but I think when you play them, it comes gray. Probably this is the same problem that Aptor people were
changing now?
Just before. Yes, it is changing.
Okay, so I think it should work now. Sorry for the challenges. Anyhow, starting in the 1940s and 50s, a series of studies in the US and around the world began to establish that actually people can age at apparently different rates, and that aging is as much a consequence of lifestyle as it is chronological age. And a number of studies showed that people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s could maintain relatively high levels of cardiovascular function, high levels of muscular strength and endurance, and so on. And so gradually, the scientific world began to understand that physiological changes, psychosocial changes, and health actually could be impacted by lifestyle factors. So this slide I have here, I have a London bus in the middle of the slide, and that's to remind me of a very famous epidemiological study conducted by Jeremy Morris in my hometown, London. And what Morris did was compare heart disease rates between bus drivers and bus conductors. Now, the bus drivers sat all day and drove a bus in heavy London traffic, and the conductor ran up and down the stairs of these double-decker buses, collecting fares from the passengers. And what this groundbreaking research showed was there was substantially less heart disease between the individuals who had physically active lifestyles versus the drivers who were seated. And it really marked in the 1950s the beginning of a series of epidemiological studies that were able to establish that there's a strong relationship between physical activity and the development of chronic diseases and conditions. Similar work was conducted in the Framingham Heart Disease Study in Massachusetts, but also by the work of Ralph Pathenberger and others. And the gentleman with no hair at the top of the slide is Stephen Blair, who was the principal investigator of the heart disease study that was conducted in Dallas, Texas. And his research showed that people who were even slightly more active than sedentary people had a significant reduction in risk of both mortality and morbidity. So the first phase that I was going to talk about was establishing the knowledge base or building the evidence base. And it's my belief that that is now pretty well established, and there are very few people who doubt that physical activity has substantial evidence for its beneficial effects. Phase two was seeking consensus among professionals in the area. So even though research had been conducted on the physical, psychological, and social benefits of regular physical activity, there were still a lot of people who doubted whether this was in fact the case. And there was a real need to build consensus among health professionals, among politicians, among various other individuals who had influence over our society. In 1995, the World Health Organization gathered together some of the experts from around the world to try to develop WHO guidelines for physical activity. I was fortunate enough to be one of the scientists who was at that meeting. I was representing the United States of America. And we had individuals from 20 countries representing multiple disciplines: medicine, public health, gerontology, physical therapy, kinesiology, met in Germany, in Heidelberg, under the leadership of a Brazilian, Alexander Kalash, who was the head of the Aging and Health Program at the WHO. And we were charged with making a definitive statement from the WHO about the need to promote physical activity in the 50+ population. And the WHO guidelines essentially summarized the case for physical activity, and they divided it into two major arguments. One was the benefits for each individual, but secondly, the benefits for society and for the community for promoting physical activity. So I've already talked a little bit about the benefits of physical activity for the individual. We know now that physiological changes, that there are psychological benefits associated with decreased depression, decreased anxiety disorders. And we also know that individuals who are physically active are less likely to be socially isolated and more likely to be engaged in their communities. But one of the, I think, most important things that the WHO guidelines stressed was that there is a societal benefit associated with promoting physical activity. Physically active communities have reduced health and social care costs. Older adults who remain active are more productive. They're able to continue working for longer, and they promote a positive and active image of older persons. You know, I know that when I started working in this area more than 40 years ago, the dominant image of an older person was a rocking chair that somebody would sit in upon their retirement. And I think that that has changed. And now many people are used to seeing older individuals physically active in the community, out in the streets. Now, one of the things that I think the WHO guidelines tried to focus on was that physical activity is not only for the athletic individual, the person who likes to perform sports, but if you think about the population as being distributed along a continuum, what the WHO guidelines said that really everybody along this continuum benefits from being physically active. Finally, the WHO guidelines stressed that there's a need to develop public policy that will facilitate increased access to and participation in physical activity. In other words, that there was a responsibility from policymakers at all levels of administration, national, regional, and local, to promote access to and utilization of resources for promoting physical activity. So step one was building the evidence base. Step two was promoting or building a consensus among professionals. Step three really was to educate the public and build consumer demand. So I think we had the scientific base. We had convinced professionals that this was important, but many members of the general public really were not convinced that they needed to be more physically active, and there really wasn't a widespread demand from the consumer to have facilities and resources to be more physically active. So almost 25 years ago, in 1999, the WHO declared the 7th of April as World Health Day. And that year they focused on active aging makes the difference. And I was involved at that time with the WHO program that implemented something called the Global Embrace, which was locally organized walks or other physical activity events around the globe in every time zone around the world. And so I remember very well in Rio de Janeiro, there was a organized dancing session on Copacabana Beach, in which hundreds and hundreds of older people came together to dance the samba and to be physically active. And a lot of these events were covered in the media, on BBC, on Deutsche Welle, on national media outlets. And really, in some countries, for the first time, there was significant media coverage of the importance of being physically active in order to change the minds of older people, to empower them to see themselves as being physically active individuals. Now, actually, Brazil has played a major role in the public health messaging related to promoting physical activity in the population. The gentleman in this slide here is Victor Matsudo, who is a public health scientist from Sao Paulo. And his group organized a national campaign called Agita São Paulo, which got adopted by the WHO and called Agita Mundo. But the focus of the campaign was to talk to the public about the importance of building physical activity, 30 minutes of physical activity into your everyday lives. And it was a very innovative and creative public health campaign. They persuaded doctors to hand out boxes to their patients that looked like they were prescription medicine boxes, but they were for Agitol. And when you opened the box, it just simply gave you some advice as to how to build physical activity into your everyday lives. And so that was an early example of how to build consumer demand. Sometime later in the United States, we developed a program called You Can, Steps to a Healthy Aging, that tied healthy nutrition with increased physical activity and implemented the program in US government-funded area agencies on aging all around the country. And at that time, I was the principal investigator of the national program for promoting physical activity called the National Blueprint. And I remember talking to the US minister responsible for aging and trying to convince her that we needed to implement a public education campaign. And 8 months later, we had more than 2 million older adults participating in the You Can program. So really an important example that it is possible to build consumer awareness and consumer demand through various types of public information campaigns. So phase 4 is building the public policy framework. And where I became involved in this really was in the early 2000s. The WHO had developed an active aging policy framework that it presented at an international meeting in Madrid in 2002. And what the active aging policy focused on was the need to promote physical activity across the entire adult lifespan. So if you take a look at this conceptual figure, in early life, as children develop, they grow and develop and maintain their physical strength. They increase their cardiovascular performance, their muscular endurance, muscle strength, and so on. And then as aging occurs across adult life, for almost all individuals, there's a decrease in peak performance from youth down towards old age. But what you want to happen is for this decline to be a relatively shallow slope, like the red line in this graph, so that when people reach old age, they are well above the disability threshold. Unfortunately, what happens for many individuals who live sedentary lifestyles, they follow an accelerated degeneration curve, and sometime in late middle age, they approach or fall below the disability threshold. And traditional medicine does a really good job of keeping people alive, but it doesn't necessarily help them maintain independence and prevent disability. And so what the WHO policy framework suggested was we really need to have lifelong interventions to prevent people from prematurely dropping below the disability threshold. Now, how to do that? Well, I think one thing is clear is that aging is a complex phenomenon, and it's not sufficient to only pay attention to one variable. But if you think in this graph, successful active aging in the middle is not just dependent on personal determinants, but there are many environmental, social, economic, and behavioral determinants that also contribute to successful aging. And so from that point of view, we're beginning to realize that promoting healthy and independent aging is more than the responsibility of any single group, but it's really much more of a societal responsibility. And this slide indicates that, you know, governments, agencies in the public sector have a responsibility, companies in the private sector, NGOs, universities and research facilities, as well as international organizations, all need to come together to develop a strategy to promote active and successful aging across the community. So in the United States, the Department of Health and Human Services, for the first time in 2008, developed physical activity guidelines for all Americans. This effort was led by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, and it really marked a change in thinking of national governments around the world that they needed to develop a policy framework for promoting active and healthy lifestyles. The US guidelines were followed rapidly by guidelines from the UK, from Australia, from the Netherlands, and they all focused on the importance from a societal perspective of having a national strategy to promote active aging. So in the United States right now, we have a National Physical Activity Plan. It is coordinated by the Centers for Disease Control, and it provides information and data about community efforts to promote physical activity nationwide, and it enables local policymakers to think about aligning what they're doing in their own community with the national strategy that has been identified by the government. So I want to focus now on phase 5, which is to refine, expand, and evolve the model. And I think that, you know, when I started in the 1970s as an undergraduate student, I think people thought, well, all you need is to be physically active, and that's really the primary way to promote healthy living in the 50+ population. I think we've realized that physical activity alone is not enough, and I want to share 2 WHO reports that look at perhaps a more complex way of viewing healthy lifestyle. The first report is the Global Age-Friendly Cities Guide. So cities and municipalities around the world have begun to start thinking about what needs to happen in order for them to change their resources and facilities to promote more physical activity. And I'm gonna try and show you a complicated slide that has 3 sections to it. I hope this is gonna work. Okay, do Oops, yeah, let me see. Okay, do you see a picture of a street with some cars in it? Andre, yes? Okay, very good. And so imagine that you are 90 years old and you have been told by your physician, you need to try to get out and walk a little bit more. And you are faced with a street that looks a little bit like this. And frankly, that is a daunting task to imagine you're going to cross this street. And what a number of urban planners and urban design researchers began to explore is how can we make environmental changes to help make our streets more supportive or more conducive to people adopting healthy lifestyles. So you'll see now in this picture, we have installed very clear crosswalks. The crosswalks have countdown timers. In many cities in the United States now, if you have a mobility disability, your physician can give you a device you clip to your belt, and it will send a message to the timer on the traffic lights and give you more time to cross the streets. However, really what we want to do is to change our neighborhoods so that not only is it easier and more friendly for people to cross the streets, there's also a reason to cross the streets. So now we have a store or a shop over here, and the older adult, instead of just crossing the street, can cross the street to do some shopping or get some coffee. And the concept here is building physical activity into everyday lives. So it's not simply exercise for exercise sake, but it is something that is environmentally supported. And you know, I will note that Curitiba in Brazil is really quite famous around the world for environmental changes that have promoted access to physically active lifestyles. And I think that increasingly around the world, people are putting in bike paths and other resources to promote healthy lifestyles. So, you know, I have been coming to Brazil for many years, and my sogros live in Florianopolis. And I'll say that there have been major environmental changes in the Beira-Mar area in Floripa that have enabled people to walk and ride bicycles and do different kinds of exercise. And I think that that is a very socially responsible thing to do. Now, much of America looks like this. On first glance, it looks very nice. The palm trees, but imagine that a couple moved into the pink house you see on the left here, and they grew old, and eventually the husband died, the children moved away, the widow lives in this house on her own, and eventually she loses her driving privileges. Well, this beautiful house then becomes for her effectively a prison, because you'll notice that there are no sidewalks or pavements for walking on. There's not much shade. There's been no thinking placed with respect to how to make an environment conducive to people being more physically active. And so I think around the world now, there's an increasing movement on promoting physically active environmental design so that we don't become overly dependent on the automobile, and that we enable people to find ways to build physical activity into their lives. Oops, let me see. Ooh, I'm sorry. So the second WHO report I want to comment on is one that I worked on myself on falls prevention, preventing older adults from falling in later life. And I think what's interesting here is that falls occur due to a combination of different factors. So if you have an older parent, my mother is 91 years old, she lives in London, and occasionally she does fall, and she has broken her hip while falling. And if I think about some of the factors that increase a person's susceptibility to fall, there are visual issues related to vision problems. Absolutely, physical inactivity can cause a loss of muscle strength and a loss of balance. But there are also environmental factors in the home that make you more likely to fall. And for many older adults, simply taking multiple medications can promote interactions among the various medications that can make older adults more conducive to falling. So I think what I want to say, so that we have some time for questions, is that, whoops. Okay. I'm having trouble seeing my slides. Just a minute. There we go. Okay. The first point I want to make is that physical activity is not enough, and that many times falls or other adverse outcomes occur due to a combination of different factors. So my first recommendation is to develop comprehensive strategies for healthy aging across the life course. So it's not sufficient to wait until people grow old if you want to impact their independence and their quality of life. You really need to develop a national strategy that starts in childhood and goes all the way through to old age. So I am a 65-year-old man, but I have a 3-year-old daughter, an 8-year-old daughter, and 2 10-year-old twins. And I care deeply about the physical activity and physical education programs that my children get in the school system, because I know that laying down a foundation, not just physiologically, but behaviorally, for promoting physically active lifestyles is going to be critically important in what happens to them as they grow older. My second recommendation: it's important for us to design and deliver culturally appropriate, multi-component lifestyle intervention strategies. So if you want older adults to be able to age successfully in place in their homes, you're going to have to address not only to lifestyle factors like physical activity, but you're going to have social care in place. You're going to have health care in place. You know, in the Brazil program, Ciências Sem Fronteiras program, I was invited to come to Brazil to do a study in Rio Grande do Sul using agente de saúde and their role in promoting healthy lifestyles across the Brazilian nation. And I'll have you know that in the US, we really don't have any kind of federally funded national strategy to promote basic healthcare interventions nationwide. And what I saw in Brazil with the Centro de Saúde and the role played by community health workers was actually, for me, quite impressive, because I think that it provides a social and health safety net for Brazilians of all incomes and all ages and all ethnicities, and is actually, to me, very impressive. Recommendation for the future 3, build and empower multi-sector collaborations. You know, this is not work that is to be done by universities. It's not work to be done by the federal government. It's not work to be done by municipalities. It's not work to be done by NGOs. It's really a concerted effort of all of these groups to come together and to share resources and develop a collaborative strategy. And I think in cities that do that well, they make a difference in the lives of the residents in those cities. Recommendations for the future: increase our ability to predict age-related declines in functioning. You know, I wouldn't want to suggest that it's possible to avoid the aging process. It clearly isn't. We are all going to die, but we are going to age at different rates, and different systems in our body are susceptible to differential factors that impact their decreased functioning. And we are beginning to have a science of epigenetics, of biomarkers, to increase our understanding of who is at risk and what potentially can be done to mitigate some of those risk factors. And there's clearly a lot of research that is needed to increase our understanding as to why people decline at different rates. Well, as a university administrator, I would be delinquent if I didn't make a strong case for the need for continued investment in research into all aspects of science, but from a selfish perspective, certainly in health-related and public health research. I watched with horror a few weeks ago when the Brazilian government announced what I can only call draconian cuts in federal funding for scientific research in Brazil. I think it is astonishing to me that the government can be so irresponsible in reducing funding for critically important scientific research, and without question, that funding needs to be restored as soon as possible. So I've taken you on a journey where I have talked about my passion, which is the promotion of physically active and healthy lifestyles at a population level. Most of my work has been based in public policy. I've argued that we have now established the scientific basis for this work. We have achieved consensus among professionals, health professionals, scientists, and others that this is important. The most important step forwards are to continue to develop public policy that enables more people to participate in these healthy lifestyles, to recognize that healthy and active aging requires multiple factors and multiple determinants, and it takes a village or a coalition to make a difference. Now, I absolutely believe that this is consistent with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, because ultimately, if we are able to restructure our societies in such a way to empower people to remain as independent and as functional for as long as possible, this has critically important implications, not only for the developing world, but also for the developed world. And I am grateful for the opportunity to spend a few minutes with you this afternoon. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you very, very, very much. Well, people probably they organizing the question. I have one quite tricky one for you, because as you know, I work with falls and trying to predict falls in the older age. And the thing is that on your point 4, you said increase the ability to predict declines. Okay. I think we have developed several tools like the frailty index and balance measures and so on. What do you think about these measures, and what do you think about the future of our ability to measure these declines? Where do you think the scientific community is pointing to?
Yeah, you know, I would like to see, as part of the routine annual physical exam, some very rudimentary tests of physical performance that can be performed in the physician's office. So we're not talking about sophisticated research instruments, but we're talking about some relatively simple measures of upper and lower body strength, some measures of balance, some measures of flexibility, some measures of mobility. And my colleagues in the United States, Roberta Rickley and Jesse Jones, have developed a test called the Senior Fitness Test that they have established age group norms from about age 60 all the way to about age 100. And I think what would be really valuable would be for the physician's office, not necessarily the physician themselves, but somebody in that office annually to measure performance along those variables. And initially, they can take a look at norms to see whether an individual is above or below the average for their age and sex. But over time, they can plot the curve of a decrease in functioning. And if an individual appears to be at risk for disability or at risk for falls, perhaps 10 years from now, it gives an opportunity to make a prescription for some kind of an intervention that will at least have the possibility of decreasing the rate of decline and postponing disability. And so I don't think that this is very sophisticated. It really just takes a commitment to viewing physical activity as a vital sign, to including questioning about that in much the same way as we ask questions about alcohol, tobacco, we ask questions about vision and other sensory performances. So it's not an easy thing to do, Andre, but I think it's possible.
Okay, thank you very much. People, if you have any questions, I know some people here that are also into physical activity for older adults. So if you have any questions, please don't be shy.
Well, while we're waiting for questions, let me say that, you know, I think our mutual friend, Pedro Halal from Pelotas, he is a real gem of a researcher leading a worldwide group of epidemiologists and other physical activity researchers whose work published in The Lancet in the UK has really done a tremendous amount to increase awareness of the importance of physical activity and physically active policy around the world. And I think the Brazilians should be really proud of the leadership role that people like Victor Matsudo or Pedro Halal have taken in building an international coalition to study and promote these areas of research.
Okay, it's a great point. Pedro is a great researcher, and he's done you know, so many studies related to physical activity. I have provoked Pedro recently, and I'll provoke you as well, because one of the things we wanted to do, which it's on our horizon, is to probably have some easy measures, but provided by these marvelous machines that we can just test you know, other people's homes, on their homes, or to perform very, very simple tests at the physicians, and all the data would be stored in the cloud and would provide straight away for the clinician, or even for the person who was submitted to the exam, the results, right? So that would be something really, really interesting, as we could build up a large bank of data but using, as you mentioned, very simple tests, very simple things. And my idea that I start discussing with Pedro, and I also want to provoke you, is how can we build such an application that could be available for everyone, and also the data bank available for everyone. So we would have, really good measures, and probably we could have different references for different regions, sex, and physical activity all over the world. So this is something that is our own mind, is on our mind.
Andre, I'm going to push back a little bit and say, if we're going to develop these tools, if we're going to put this database in the cloud, in the Ethernet, there has to be a good reason for doing it. And, I would suggest that simply collecting more data that documents that if you are physically active, there are significant health benefits is really not what we need right now. I think what we need right now is much more research on how to convince people who are sedentary and know intellectually that they should be active, but somehow have real difficulty in changing their behavior to meet the goals that they need. So, if you think about the public health literature on smoking cessation and how to move somebody from a 2 or 3 pack a day smoker to being somebody who never smokes again, is an extremely complex behavioral challenge. And I think that, yes, we can use accelerometers, smartphones, and other technology to help us answer those kinds of questions. So can we prompt people? Can we reward people? Can we help extrinsically motivate people as they kind of embark on these challenges of changing their behavior? But that's not going to be as simple as simply measuring the numbers of steps that people take. I do envision that you can start to look a little bit more at patterns of physical activity, when during the day people are active. And I think there is the beginnings of a promising literature in that area. But I hope that we're not just trying to answer questions we already know the answers of, but rather we're thinking about what it is we can do to provide solutions for the problems that we're not really very good at.
Okay, excellent thinking. Okay, guys, anyone else? Okay, so Professor Wojtek, thank you so much for your nice talk. And I would like to invite you to be here with us if you wish to, because I want to introduce you to the next 2 speakers. Okay, one of them is Professor Elise Elliot, and the other is Professor Emily Murphy. Both are from West Virginia University, where I particularly had the opportunity to visit some time ago with Gonzalo Bravo, who is also a close friend that is working there. So first of all, I want to welcome both colleagues that will have a nice presentation. But first, let me just very briefly,
and I just apologize to my colleagues. I'm at a conference and I have to go down to another session, but I promise Emily and your colleague, I will try and look up the recording of the video. And I just want to say thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you very much. It was absolutely our pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so I want to briefly introduce you Elise Elliot, who has a master's in physical education at Chodzko-Zajko University and a PhD in curriculum and instruction at Virginia Polytechnic Institute University. There's a lot of things here in your CV. Of course, I'll try to make it as shorter as possible. I would just like to report basically what she's been doing from the biographical sketch, and saying that she's in the role as the Ware Distinguished Professor in the College of Physical Activity and Sports Science at West Virginia. Dr. Elise Elliot primary focus is on the outreach and research that will improve the health and well-being of citizens of West Virginia, with a particular interest in children and their families. Notable leadership roles include the development and the implementation of population-based interventions, including first West Virginia Physical Activity Plan, 2 statewide physical activity symposiums to improve physical activity, participation and healthy living in children, adolescents and families in school and community settings. Dr. Elliot has developed and currently maintained Active Academics, a nationwide recognized web-based research for K-8 classroom teachers to integrate physical activity throughout the school day. She serves as co-director of West Virginia Cardiac Project, a statewide children's health surveillance and intervention initiative in collaboration with West Virginia School of Medicine Department of Pediatrics. Most recently, she co-chaired the Center for Active West Virginia to provide an effective statewide physical activity framework to promote population sector input and collaboration, facilitate physical activity research among multidisciplinary teams, and guide state and local policy and practice. She had many opportunities to serve on state and national committees, including serving as a member of 3-year term on U.S. President Council of Fitness, Sport, Nutrition, and Science Board. Professor Elliot currently teaches doctoral level courses in coaching and teaching studies programs in CPAS, which is the Department of West Virginia. Curriculum and evaluation and dissertation seminar. On the other hand, Professor Emily Murphy, she has also MSc on exercise physiology at West Virginia and a PhD in the same field at the same university. As a research interest, she looks at childhood obesity, policy, systems, and environmental change related to physical activity and food access in rural communities. Community and school-based healthy lifestyles interventions, physical activity promotion across lifespan. She is also involved in teaching, research, and service, all focused on individual, environmental, and system change that promote making the healthier choice, the easier choice for children, families, and communities throughout West Virginia and nationwide. She has been and is currently the principal investigator on grants obtained from several federal agencies, including the CDC and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Dr. Murphy has published 18 peer-reviewed articles and has presented her research at many national meetings throughout her tenure with West Virginia University. So please be welcome, both of you, Professor Murphy and Professor Elliot. Thank you very much for being with us. I think it's going to be a fantastic time with you. You're welcome.
Thank you so much. So how can I share my slides with everyone?
There's a on the bottom, there's a green.
Okay,
thing.
share screen.
Share screen, that's it. Here we are.
Okay, and you're seeing the big slides?
Yes.
Wonderful. So thank you for having us, and we're looking forward to sharing this presentation with you this afternoon. So Dr. Elliot and I have been working together for a very long time here at West Virginia University, and we're really going to highlight one of the major programs that we've been working on for over 20 years. So today we're going to present on the Coronary Artery Risk Detection in Appalachian Communities project, which we refer to as the Cardiac Project. And I'm having a hard time advancing my slides. Hold on. Okay, so what is the Cardiac Project? The Cardiac Project is a school-based chronic disease risk factor surveillance, intervention, and research initiative that was developed here in West Virginia in 1998. It was developed at the time where I was actually a graduate assistant getting my master's degree here in exercise physiology. We began this project in 3 West Virginia counties. And really the purpose from the onset of this project was to identify children and their families, those children and their families that had abnormal cholesterol values. And specifically, we were looking to identify families that had familial hypercholesterolemia, which is a cholesterol disorder that puts you at very high risk of developing heart disease and premature death at an early age. When this project began, again, it was really a cardiovascular screening program, but we quickly realized in the first couple of years of the project that West Virginia had an epidemic, an obesity epidemic, similar probably to many states in the country, but also other countries throughout the world. But West Virginia, we found that 50% of the kids that we were screening were either overweight or obese. So it kind of morphed into both a cholesterol screening project, but also an obesity prevention project as well. Within just a few years, we transitioned from a 3-county kind of pilot project into a statewide initiative. And from 1998 up into the year of 2017, we actually screened school-age children, kindergartners, second graders, and 5th graders throughout the state in all 55 counties of West Virginia. In 2017, up until 2017, our project was actually funded by the West Virginia State Legislature. So it was a line item through our state to fund this project. In 2017, we had a change of our governor in the state, and our funding was cut. So we, as a team, again, we've been working together on this project for a very long time, started to look for other ways to help fund the cardiac project. And within a year, we were able to kind of reinvent cardiac using a different funding stream that is known as the SNAP-Ed, or Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program funding, that is funded through the USDA. And we were able to kind of restart and rethink the cardiac project. So we're going to kind of talk about both of those phases throughout our presentation. But to date, in the 23 years that we've been doing the screenings, we have reached over 245,000 West Virginia children. So again, the infrastructure for screening has changed over the years. When cardiac was first developed, we actually, the infrastructure was utilizing the West Virginia Rural Health Education Partnerships. So this was a program that was developed, again, funded through the state as well, to offer health science students the opportunity to do rural rotations and clinical rotations in rural settings. Unfortunately, RHEP also lost its funding, and in that time, we then had to transition to hiring actually cardiac staff to help do the screenings. But prior to that, when RHEP was in existence, we were able to utilize their regional coordinators and also a kind of a comrade of health science students to help do the screenings in the public school system. Right now, we've transitioned to the SNAP-Ed funding program, which is run through what we call our West Virginia University Extension Service. So here in the United States, every every state has a land grant university. West Virginia University is one of 2 land grants actually here in West Virginia. And the land grant mission is really to provide our communities throughout the state with the research and teaching that we develop here in Morgantown or at other land grant institutions, and take those out to communities. So with our extension service, which the SNAP-Ed funding is through, we have extension faculty and health educators in all 55 of our counties. And we rely heavily on our health educators in those counties to help with the school screenings to date. So what are the project aims, or what are our aims of the cardiac project? Again, really to identify at-risk children and parents, and then provide this information to healthcare providers and also school personnel of those kids and families that are at risk. We have another aim to reduce childhood obesity, again, through the dissemination of several educational interventions, which you mentioned some of those in introducing Dr. Elliot earlier, but we're going to expand upon kind of some of those interventions that we're doing throughout the state later on in the presentation. And then to promote healthier children and families through partnerships. So we're going to talk a little bit about our strategic partnerships in educational settings, state government, and also local communities and private sectors as we go on as well. And then to inform county and state stakeholders in addressing the state's health problems related to obesity. So there's not very many people, in West Virginia that probably haven't heard about the Cardiac Project, because we have been in existence for 23 years. And really a lot of the findings from the Cardiac Project has helped kind of develop and implement some policy change and work in the state as well. So I'm going to first go over kind of the surveillance component of the Cardiac Project. So again, it's really it's really focused around school-based screenings. We started again, our pilot project in our 3 West Virginia counties started with our 5th grade kids. We expanded that throughout the years to involve kindergarten and 2nd graders as well. So we actually have what we call our passive screening, which involves our kindergarten, 2nd and 5th grade. We were able to get through our institutional review board here at West Virginia University passive consent, which means only those families that choose for their child not to participate have to sign a waiver for their child not to participate. And then we also have an active consent for only 5th graders that includes additional risk factor screenings as well. But for the passive consent, kindergarten, 2nd and 5th grade, we do BMI screenings, so height and weight, and calculate BMI and BMI percentile. We look on the back of the children's neck for a marker called acanthosis nigricans, which is really kind of like a raised kind of lesion or discoloration of the skin any place where your skin folds, that's indicative of insulin resistance and risk for type 2 diabetes. And we look for that on all the kids in the passive screening as well. In 5th graders, up until 2017, when we lost funding through the state, our active consent included a family history questionnaire, blood pressure screenings, and then a fasting lipid profile. So we were actually drawing blood on children for a fasting lipid profile in school. When our funding changed in 2017, we are no longer allowed to do blood work on the children because it is not because it's not approved through our funding agency of SNAP-Ed. So SNAP-Ed is really can be used for educational and screening, but we're not allowed to collect any kind of biomedical samples with our current funding. After the screening, parents receive their child's health report by mail, and it includes the health findings for either, again, the passive or active consent process, depending on which they've participated in. We have an established hotline that parents can call and ask any questions. I will tell you that most of the calls that we've received in our hotline over the years are really targeted towards the child's obesity or weight, more so than even concern of their cholesterol values. So we've done some studies and have published a paper on kind of parents' perception of their own child's weight status and children, and we've been able to conclude that parents aren't very accurate in detecting whether their children are at risk or are overweight, and it actually is worse in younger children. So with our kindergartners, parents are very inaccurate in kind of assessing their own child's weight status. We then do send the 5th grade individual results to healthcare providers. So again, making that kind of educational kind of clinical connection so that the healthcare providers are privy to the children's screening through the schools is very important to develop kind of that that connection with our healthcare system in West Virginia as well. And then we also send the results to school principals, county superintendents, the aggregate data to school principals, county superintendents, and state leaders to receive those reports at the school level and the county-based level. So again, this is so total number of kids that we've screened to date, 242,663. As you can see, 108 fifth grade children, about 107 seventh grade children, and 26 or almost 27,000 kindergartners to date. We, when we restarted the cardiac project, or kind of reinvented the cardiac project a couple of years ago, obviously with COVID hitting, caused for us to stall the in-school screenings. So we were not able to screen in school last year. But we're hoping that this spring we're gonna be able to reinstate that in-school screening process. So what does the data look like from the family history that we've taken over the years? West Virginia, unfortunately, is known for being kind of at the bottom of kind of the list as far as healthy behaviors, and at the top of the list for unhealthy behaviors and kind of health outcomes in the United States. And so as you can see, of those kids that were screened through the cardiac project, 34 of them are in homes where smoking is prevalent in their home. 32% of the families screened have a family history of heart disease. That's a first-degree relative that has suffered a heart attack or has been seen for a cardiac related event. 34% report having a family history of high or abnormal cholesterol, and 52% of our families in the cardiac project report having, again, that first degree relative with a family history of diabetes. So in West Virginia, 1 out of 3 individuals in West Virginia are diabetic. And through the cardiac project, we have identified several young children who did not know that they were at risk for diabetes or were already type 2 diabetics. So the comprehensive screening, so that's the screening that we included, the cholesterol values and blood pressures. With our 5th grade children, we've screened almost 100,000 kids utilizing that active consent process. We have found consistently over the last 23 years that about anywhere between about 47 to 50% of the kids that we screen on a yearly basis in 5th grade are either overweight or obese. We have not seen a decline in the obesity rates in West Virginia, but we luckily over the last 23 years haven't seen a significant increase either. So that leveling off or maintaining the current rate, we take as a positive, even though, again, we would like to see those levels becoming lower. We've identified 23% of the children that are that participate to have high blood pressure or blood pressure above the 95th percentile. We have 25% of the kids that we screened have abnormal blood cholesterol. The most common cholesterol abnormalities that we see through the cardiac projects are slight increases in the LDL cholesterol, but even more prevalent amongst our kids is the low HDL levels, which we know that HDL is the good cholesterol and is directly related to obesity status, but also other behavioral modifications like increasing physical activity will help increase your HDL. So again, we see a low physical activity rate amongst our children and adults in West Virginia and a high obesity level. So these abnormalities in cholesterol are not necessarily surprising, but again, ones that we want to try to improve over time. We also have seen consistently about 5% of the kids that we screen positive for acanthosis nigricans. Typically, acanthosis nigricans, or what we call AN, is seen in populations of kind of ethnic minorities, so African American, Native American populations, Latino populations. And what we're seeing here in West Virginia, mostly amongst Caucasian individuals, is rates that are comparable to kind of those, again, those high-risk ethnic populations where diabetes is more prevalent. So of those kids that are positive for AN2, we are showing that about 60% of them are insulin resistant, even, and this is at the 5th grade level. So in addition to screening the children, those kids that have been screened, we offer a free voucher for parents to go and get blood cholesterol levels checked at a local laboratory. We don't have necessarily a lot of parents that take us up on that screening, but to date, we have about 5,500 parents who were screened between 1999 and 2016. We've, for some reason, more mothers or females participated in the parental screening versus the males. And of those parents that were screened, and there's a variety of screening or reasons that parents didn't take us up on the free screening, being that access to healthcare is an issue in West Virginia, so getting to the laboratory may have been difficult. Also, a lot of parents may have had their own private insurance and were able to get the screening utilizing a different mechanism. But again, this offering these parents the screening tool obviously was beneficial for some. So of the parents that were screened, 57% of those parents had abnormal lipid values, either low HDL or high total cholesterol. And again, as somebody that was answering the hotline for a long period of time, and people were able to call in, we were able to identify families that were very high at risk and had no idea that their lipid values were as high as they were. Fathers had a greater prevalence of dyslipidemias than the mothers did. And we did find that parents that participated in the screening tended to be more educated, more aware of family history for cardiovascular disease, and less likely to smoke than those parents that did not participate or did not take the opportunity to use that free voucher to get their lipids tested. So what have we, what has come about from the Cardiac Project as far as clinical research? So we have seen some improvements in health outcomes throughout the state. Again, Dr. Elliot's going to talk about the different interventions. So we know that it's not just screenings, that we need to intervene with our families as well. And throughout this 23 years of the Cardiac Project, we've done various different interventions to help improve health outcomes. We've proven that there's a relationship between obesity and associated comorbidities in 5th grade children. I'll show you a slide here in a minute, showing again those children that are either overweight or obese, their increased risk for having other risk factors. One of the other main kind of outcomes or aims of the cardiac study the Cardiac Project is to identify children and families that have genetic hypercholesterolemia or FH. And we not only in the state have we been able to provide the screening for the children, but we have this project is also in partnership with the School of Medicine. So we have lipid clinics throughout the state where physicians from WVU Medicine see these children that are identified with high cholesterol values and genetic dyslipidemias as well. One of the probably most noteworthy or kind of highlights of the Cardiac Project was we published a article in the Journal of Pediatrics stating that universal cholesterol screening is now recommended for all children. So because of the Cardiac Project, we actually were able to prove that the need for universal versus selective screening for young children. And really what we found the need for universal screening is because a lot of children, their parents aren't necessarily old enough to show cardiac events, or children aren't living with their biological parents or a variety of reasons. The need for universal screening is there versus selective screening based on family history, because a lot of families don't either know their family history or they're too young to again have those kind of cardiac related events. And so the need for cholesterol screening universally in 5th grade kids is recommended to date. So this is the slide that I was talking about, that we've shown that the children that we identify as being at risk. So the blue or the kind of the navy blue or cobalt blue bar are the kids that are at risk for overweight, and the yellow bars are those children that are overweight. And you can see total cholesterol, LDL, HDL cholesterol, all kids that are at risk for overweight or overweight are significantly higher rates of cholesterol abnormalities. They also are more likely to have increased triglycerides, increased systolic and diastolic blood pressure, and much more likely to present with acanthosis nigricans than their normal weight or underweight counterparts. As I've talked about a little bit already, but again, want to point out that the familial hypercholesterolemia is a genetic condition that causes high cholesterol. Typically about 1 in 250 people will present with FH. It's an autosomal dominant disorder. Therefore, 50% of individuals that have FH will pass on that genetic mutation to their offspring. And only 10% of people that have FH know that they have FH. So Dr. Bill Neal, who was the founder of the Cardiac Project, he's a pediatric cardiologist, or was a pediatric cardiologist here at West Virginia University. He really kind of had this special interest in developing a registry for familial hypercholesterolemia here in West Virginia and nationwide. And so one of the purposes of the Cardiac Project and some of our interventions have focused on identifying and treating individuals with FH here in West Virginia again and throughout the nation. And with that, I am going to pass over the microphone to Eloise, but I will continue to do the slides since I have my screen up, if that's okay, Dr. Elliot.
I forgot I had muted myself. Yes, that's fine. Thank you, Dr. Murphy. And before I start, how much time do we have? Just like
including the questions, we have something about half an hour, but as this
okay,
is
like
the
10
last
minutes
one,
would be fine, right?
Yeah, you don't have to worry about the time.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the interventions that we've done over the years and different interventional strategies that have really focused mostly on physical activity and dietary intake. So looking at it at kind of a sociology theory framework, I've kind of divided them here in terms of individual strategies, community strategies, and policy and systems strategies. And our interventions really have been grounded in research and professional expertise. And we have selected them to meet the needs of the people that we serve, the needs and preferences of our targeted audience here in West Virginia. So on the next slide, you'll see some of the micro level interventions or the individual interventional strategies that we've used. Dr. Murphy has mentioned some of these, obviously the screening process itself and the educational materials that we send home to the parents is an important interventional strategy that we use with the individuals, the children and their parents. We also, as she mentioned, send those results to the children's primary care physicians. And so we have recently just done a study with primary care physicians that have received these results from the Cardiac Project. And we were happy to know that they found these as very helpful in their practice because oftentimes they did not, on well visits and so forth, did not talk to children and their parents about any of the things that we talked about, like the particularly obesity, childhood obesity, being overweight or obese. We also provide a website with different types of information there. We have social media messaging as well. And those are at the end of the presentation if anyone's interested in logging into any of those. We do have a cardiacwv.org website that has all the information pretty much that Emily and I have talked about, or a lot of it. So you can revisit that there at that website and see what we're currently doing. We have also, over the years, one of the first interventions that the Cardiac Project adopted, and actually it was what brought me on board with the Cardiac Project years ago, was a web-based educational module that I had spearheaded for 5th grade children that teachers could use in the classroom. It was called Healthy Hearts for Kids. It's no longer available with all the new technology, but we also then developed one called Take Charge, Be Healthy, which was focused on middle and high school children or youth. And we currently have one called West Virginia Healthy Kids, which we are in the process of kind of renaming and reworking just a little bit to make it more with a national focus. We also are reinventing Take Charge, Be Healthy, but we're making it focused also for 5th grade, since that is one of our, obviously, one of our targeted audiences in the schools with children. Dr. Murphy also mentioned that we do have pediatric cardiologists that work on the project and help lead the project. And they do have preventative cardiology clinics for children and adolescents around the state. So if the children have been identified through the Cardiac Project or through the School of Medicine and live in different parts of the state, they can go to these more local clinics that the physicians provide services to. So those are just a few of the things we've done at the individual level. At the community level or the meso level, we have a web-based resource for teachers called Active Academics, and there's the URL for that, where teachers can go to find a variety of mostly for targeting classroom teachers so that they can find activities that they can use in their classroom to get kids up and moving during the school day. So not just in recess, not just in physical education, but also in the classroom with academics or just to move. We have developed and implemented professional development trainings for teachers. We have one online right now. With all of the COVID, as was mentioned earlier, we've had to reinvent many of the things that we've done in person. We've done a lot of these workshops individually in schools for their teachers. We also have been fortunate to get federal funding or foundation funding for countywide school and community interventions. 2 of those were called the McDowell Choices Project and the Greenbar Choices Project. So those were 2 counties that they were implemented in, but they were a more comprehensive, more intense kind of intervention for physical activity and dietary intake in these schools and in communities. We do partner with WVU Extension on a lot of different levels. We've worked with them on what they call the 4-H Health Initiative. Emily mentioned the SNAP-Ed allocation of funding we get in West Virginia through Extension, which helps does fund the Cardiac Project now. So, and we also are just about to start a program called the Health Ambassadors that we're working with Extension on. So there's a lot of different, because as she mentioned, we have Extension employees that are called health educators in all the counties. It's a really good fit, really nice partnership for us. We also partner with the Center for Active West Virginia, which is a center at our university in our college, in the College of Physical Activity and Sport Sciences. And with that, we work with providing community and school resources. At the macro level, And again, Emily's mentioned some of these policy implications that the cardiac project has made, but I think, as she mentioned, one of the most important is how our data and what we have done influence national school screening guidelines and recommendations. We also have developed a West Virginia physical activity plan. It's modeled after the U.S. National Physical Activity Plan, and I still work with the National Physical Activity Plan. So, and Emily and I are in the process right now of leading the development, the redevelopment, I guess, or the update of the West Virginia Physical Activity Plan. And in terms of actual policies that have been implemented by like our State Department of Education and our legislature, we have also influenced two really important policies there. One, Policy 2510, that really mandated that schools had to provide 30 more minutes of physical activity a day outside of physical education. And then the House Bill 2816 was a much older policy that was passed by the legislature in, I think it was 2006, which we had input on that as well, which required schools to provide a certain amount of physical education a day. And there's been a number of other policy related and systems related changes that we've been able to influence, like developing physical education content standards for the Department of Education. Just to kind of, next slide there. Thank you. Just kind of in conclusion, related to the interventions, well, not just the interventions, the cardiac project in general. As you can see, we've had many influential implications for health and well-being of our youth and their families in West Virginia, which is typically made up of pretty much all rural communities. We, as discussed, we've provided a school-based approach, which hasn't been done that we know of. Dr. Neal always said that we're the only state that's ever really began that whole process of getting approval in all schools in our counties and our states to do this detection of chronic disease risk factors in children, and to encourage mobilization of those prevention efforts throughout their families, the PCPs, the community, and so forth. As mentioned, we provided resources and interventions for individuals and for communities and schools. And then just the contribution we have made to the development and implementation of guidelines and policies, not only at the state level, but as we mentioned, at the national level as well. We have we've had a number of different people on our team right now. This is the makeup of our team. We have a really eclectic group in terms of our expertise, which is really helpful in doing the things that we do. And this is just kind of the core team that kind of organizes and makes things happen. But we have a wide list of partners that help us and support us and provide their expertise as well. But these folks here, I don't know if you can read that on your screen, but we have people that have expertise in community advocacy and educational curriculum development, teacher training, teaching children, so being teachers themselves of children, technology, the use of technology in schools, partnering with statewide stakeholders and decision makers, and then just working with a lot of local level partners to promote health. As Dr. Murphy mentioned, the creator of the cardiac project, William Neal, he was the creator and our fearless leader and he passed away January 1st of this year, kind of unexpectedly. He really was a well-known pediatric cardiologist nationally, and he was so passionate about serving the public and promoting public health that it led him to the development of the Cardiac Project. And so none of this work that we've talked about today would have been possible without his vision and leadership. So just to conclude, we would like to open it up to questions. Can you put up that last slide there, please? There's our email addresses and also the Facebook and Twitter, and also the cardiac website is there. So we thank you for giving us this opportunity, and we would love to have any questions that you have about anything we've talked about.
Okay, thank you very much for your nice presentation. We are all definitely impressed by the quality of the work and also by the large numbers, very large numbers you have. And one of the things we noted from the first part that Professor Emily Murphy presented was the sensation that we're facing a huge time bomb, literally, because this is something that probably in the near future the whole country will feel, because we see almost a whole nation that are presenting very strong indicators. They're going to suffer loads and loads of problems related to their condition. What do you think could it convince more people to engage physical activity as a means to reduce obesity and type 2 diabetes and so on? What are your expectancies related to the project in the future, and how it can be transposed to maybe to other cultures, other places where we know already that physical activity is a key aspect. Of course, there are many other aspects such as nutrition guidance and so on, but physical activity is one of the main factors. How do we get them engaged in more physical activity?
So I'll take a stab at this, and then Dr. Elliot, you can take a stab if you would like to. But recently, in both Dr. Elliott's and my work, as you've seen, we've done individual, community, and policy work. Currently, in the last few years, we've really focused a lot of our efforts on kind of changing the environment where people live, work, and play to make physical activity access and opportunities more available, especially West Virginia. For those of you that have never had the honor of coming to visit West Virginia is, like we've said, a very rural state. It's a very economically challenged state, and it is a very geographically unique state. So it's very mountainous in many of our rural communities. And so even though the way a crow flies, it only may be 5 miles, from your home to a trail or a park or a playground. It may take you, if you get in a car, 20 to 30 minutes to get there, because the roads and the infrastructure aren't necessarily ideal in a lot of our communities throughout West Virginia. So through the Cardiac Project, some work that we've been doing with the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC here, and also through the Center for Active Living in WVU at CPAS, we've been working with communities for them to come up with solutions. So we've been working through partners with local municipalities and nonprofit organizations to kind of give seed money to communities for them to kind of brainstorm and come up with ways to engage community members in more physical activity. So, helping develop trails, some of the things we've done is development or improvement of trail systems. In some of the counties, helping to improve local parks, lighting, safety related issues, changing tennis courts into pickleball courts in some cases. So again, like really working with those local communities for them to help find the solutions instead of us as the researchers dictating what they do. We've had a lot more buy-in and I think more success, again, working with those local communities to come up with and schools to come up with solutions on their own. And then again, providing seed money and technical assistance for them to implement those changes.
Dr. Murphy, before Dr. Elliot carries on, have you got a measure of adherence on it? How people really get on board of such physical activity plans or community programs?
Yeah, like
adherence.
Well, like the physical activity plan that we mentioned earlier, developed with using the National Physical Activity Plan as a model. I think that's a good attempt. I feel like we've made a good attempt at giving people, again, kind of going back to what we said about communities coming up with their solutions. This is to get sectors, population sectors, to come up with their solutions, because, you know, it's not just up to public health, or it's not just up to schools, or it's up to all the different population sectors like business and industry and nonprofit organizations and parks and rec. I mean, it's everybody's responsibility to come up with strategies and tactics to promote physical activity. So that's what we're trying to do. We've realized that through this process that we've gone through with developing this physical activity plan, it's one thing to have a plan, but then the dissemination and the implementation and the evaluation is a whole nother thing. And that's where we're really putting our efforts here. We're revising the plan, but now we're working to really take a bigger step in getting these different sectors to buy into their responsibility to help provide those opportunities. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, you did. I just have a couple of questions as well. One of them is, have you had the follow-up data of the people that were submitted to the intervention, and to see how better they got?
We have follow-up data on the individual interventions, but in terms of how that affected their health, we don't really have that data, unfortunately. And that's a really hard, that is really hard data to get. I mean, and that's one thing, like I said, with the plan, we're looking at these outcomes for the different sectors and saying, you know, how are we going to be able to assess whether anything changed? And that's what the National Physical Activity Plan has trouble with too. It's really hard, as you know, to assess physical activity and then also to look at how that is affecting their overall health. So in a population-based approach.
One of the things that we originally wanted to try to do and were never successful in being able to figure out how to successfully do this, but one of the things that we, with the Cardiac Project, because we screen in kindergarten, 2nd and 5th grade, and at one time we actually did try to also do a screening in 9th grade, but by the time the kids are in high school, they have more of an influence or choice of whether they're getting their blood drawn or not. So it wasn't we didn't have a very high participation rate in high school students. They chose not to participate because they didn't want to get their height and weight and their blood drawn in school. But one of the things that we tried to do and work with our Department of Ed is to be able to track those kids from kindergarten to 2nd to 5th grade. But because of HIPAA and FERPA and all sorts of different kind of, I don't know, like if everybody know what HIPAA and FERPA is, I'm sure you do. But we were not able to, like, you have to consent the families at each grade level. And so we've tried to go back retrospectively and track the kids, but we didn't have a system in place to track them prospectively, if that makes sense. So and right now we're not doing the blood screenings with the kids, so we're only doing the height and weight and blood pressure with these students. But no, ideally we would have been able to track them across the kind of like their educational experience. But again, because of those limitations of doing the screening in school settings, we weren't able to.
Excellent, excellent. If there's some other questions, please let's just give us some feedback on here. Okay, and what else?
And one of the things I wanted to mention kind of in relation to your last question is what we have found with families and what's been successful about working with kids kind of as the implement to make change in families. So what we've heard, and again, this is probably more qualitatively than quantitatively, but from families is they may have known that they themselves were at risk or had risk factors for both cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes, or they themselves were overweight or obese. But when we identified these risk factors in their children, that kind of woke them up a little bit. Like they didn't necessarily realize that obesity or overweight was not just a cosmetic issue, it's a health risk. And so the kind of that realization that these young kids were also presenting with pretty serious risk factors for both cardiovascular disease and diabetes, in some cases really kind of shocked the families into implementing changes within their households or within the schools and other things too. So again, using the kids as that change agent, I think was successful as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for your answer. Okay, lads, is there any other questions? Okay, Dr. Murphy, Dr. Elliot, I want to congratulate you very much for this outstanding work. I think your work is really very, very good. It's been given, I think, indicators for public health policies, and also to help guide, people involved in physical activity to guide their activities and to propose better interventions for the whole community. Congratulations very much on your work. Okay, lads, if there's any other, yeah, please.
I just said thank you, and thanks again for giving us the opportunity. And if anyone would like more information about anything we talked about, just email us and we will, if you want to know more about the interventions or anything, just let us know and we can send you more information.
Excellent. So thank you very much for being with us. Okay, all presentations have been recorded and will be made available for everybody to watch them later on. Okay, because I'm pretty sure there's lots of people interested, but their timetables sometimes are difficult to catch up with. So I think lots of people will be in touch with you, especially some colleagues from my department that they are involved in physical activity with pediatrics. Okay, thank you very much. Anna, have you got any other words?
No, thank you to you, Wojtek, and to all speakers today. It was a great afternoon, and I'm so happy that you could come here and offer us this marvelous afternoon. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, you all. Please be safe and have a nice, almost a nice weekend.